All right, welcome to part two of our, three-part lecture series on Judaism. I left you last time after giving you a somewhat brief, but maybe to some of you, because you're sitting in front of a computer, somewhat extensive history of the biblical narrative in Judaism. So the way I was trying to distinguish that is there are these stories that exist in Judaism that Christianity later adopts as well, and Islam also, that we can't corroborate with archaeological, historical, anthropological evidence, but rather they are stories that are told over and over again that are deeply meaningful to the early Canaanites or Hebrews and remain meaningful for Jewish, Christian, and Muslims today, but that we don't put any real historical weight, right? We're not going to try to uncover whether or not Noah's flood actually existed, or if there was any evidence of the Exodus, so on and so forth. In fact, when we've gone to try to demonstrate whether or not these are actual historical events, we've come up with no evidence for any of these stories. So that's not to say they're not important, right? They're deeply important. They're myths. They're sources of religious meaning that communities today continue to look back to in order to better understand how one should act in the world, what their God is looking for, so on and so forth. So a little recap of what we discussed. This might just help some of you visualize those stories that I was just discussing for our visual learners in the class. We talked early about Adam and Eve. Many of you are familiar with the story of Adam and Eve, thought to be the kind of first creation, first human creation by God. They're created, they stray from God's will, there's some kind of punishment handed down. We then skip forward to the story of Noah, where he is the one righteous man left amongst basically all of humanity that God is now seen as unrighteous or undue of his mercy and love. So God chooses Noah as a prophet, tells him to build an ark. We saw this story again in the Epic of Gilgamesh. These are these ancient Hebrews and Canaanites taking a story directly from these ancient Mesopotamians. Floods the entire earth, floods subside, then Noah is left to repopulate the earth. Then we get to the real important prophet. In all of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, Abraham is seen as this central ancient patriarch of all of these traditions. Abraham is interpreted many ways. We talked about two of the interpretations of the story of Abraham. But, I mean, the short of it is he's commanded to sacrifice his son. This is the popular interpretation. He accepts God's will even when it goes against everything in his own moral guidance. And thus, Abraham is seen as a man of God who is willing to do anything for God. He, raises the knife or reaches for the knife. God intervenes. Abraham does not sacrifice his son. Then Isaac, the one who was to be sacrificed, has sons of his own. Jacob being the most important, whose name is changed to Israel. Now, this is where we left off in the biblical narrative. We talked about some of this other stuff as well, but this is the last thing I was talking about, where the sons of Jacob, or the sons of Israel, it's the same person, he just goes by two different names in this narrative. They're the ones who are thought to populate the region of Canaan, or what is today modern-day Israel, that strip of land there. Now, this is what we talk about when we talk about the 12 tribes of Israel. We're talking about the 12 sons of this person named Jacob, or Israel. Over time, they stray from God's will. They are left bereft, starving. There's a large drought, so they're forced to migrate to find solace, to find refuge, to find help. Unfortunately, they find themselves in Egypt. Again, this is all part of this biblical narrative. We don't know that any of this actually happened. We actually have no records of this happening. Once they find themselves in Egypt, they're enslaved. We went through that whole story. Moses comes through as this new prophet, a new person that God is speaking to or speaking through. Moses saves the day, returns his people from the enslavement in Egypt back to the land of Canaan. And in the meantime, on their way back, crossing the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, moving eastward to Canaan, God appears to him and gives him, in written form, the Ten Commandments. So we have it kind of culminating in this new instruction. So basically what God is saying here, or what these stories are saying about God, is, hey, I'm God, I'm giving you guys all of this instruction. I'm talking to Abraham, and I'm talking to Isaac, I'm talking to Noah, Adam and Eve, and so on and so forth, and you guys keep messing up. So if I can't make it any clearer, I'm going to write it down. I'm going to inscribe it into stone tablet form, known as the Ten Commandments. So it's no wonder the Ten Commandments are held to be such important artifacts in Jewish and Christian history, because this is thought to be the first time that God is actually giving you detailed instruction, right? This goes right into the sacred text, and many of the other commandments are built around these original 10. Now, once God gives his people, these Hebrews or Canaanites, these 10 commandments that are written down, God also says, he commands them in Exodus 25:8, this is the second book in the Bible, he says, make me a sanctuary so I may dwell among you, or dwell among them. So, this is interpreted in many different ways, but what they essentially do at the time is they build two different things. The first thing they build is this Ark of the Covenant. Now, the Ark of the Covenant this is just a guess as to what it might look like. We have lost this Ark of the Covenant if it ever did exist, and we've never recovered it. But the Ark of the Covenant is this chest. It's a very ornate gold-plated chest that is meant to contain, to hold, keep safe the 10 Commandments. So inside this chest you would have those original 10 Commandments that God supposedly passed down to his people, the ancient Israelites. On top of this on top of this Ark of the Covenant, you have these two cherubim, these two angels with these wings. And it's thought, this is how it's described at least, that the point at which these two angels or cherubim's wings meet, they come very, very close. They actually don't meet. They come within a millimeter of touching each other. It is between these two wings where they would meet that God is thought to reside. God actually is in that space, there on top of the Ark of the Covenant, on top of his instruction that he has handed down to humanity. So, this is huge for their people, right? God has always been something abstract, higher than, kind of coming down and intervening and lending instruction here and there. But now God says, I want to live with you. I want to be in your world. So they build him this Ark of the Covenant. They place the 10 Commandments in there, and God is thought to reside protecting the Ark of the Covenant. On top of this, they also build something called the tabernacle. Now, I don't want you to confuse these two things. Associate the Ark of the Covenant with this chest that holds the 10 Commandments. The tabernacle, think tabernacle tent, T-T, tabernacle tent. It's this big tent-like structure, not the kind of tent you'd pick up at REI and, go camping in, but rather a massive building-like tent. So huge posts, large canvas, to enclose different rooms and partition off different areas. And in the back center room of this large, extensive tent-like temple that they've built, there's a room called the Holy of Holies. And it is only to be accessed by the high priests in the ancient Canaanite or ancient Israelite community. And it is in this room that the Ark of the Covenant is held. So it is kind of kept sacred, set apart from the community, kept away from your everyday mundane experiences, and held in this room that not everyone can access. Okay, so now we're going to transition into what I just call Jewish history, or ancient Israelite history. In either way, I'm trying to explain that this is the type of history that we can corroborate with historical evidence, that we do think from this point forward these things actually happened. They're actual historical events. So these are events that are supported by historical, anthropological, and archaeological evidence. Of course, we don't have every detail. We're filling in the gaps here and there. But in general, we can assume, for example, or we can corroborate that people like King David most likely actually existed and was a ruler of this region of Canaan, which we'll get to in the next slide. Judaism, we talked about earlier, it is a history of conflict and divine intervention, right? So there are these people who live in this region of the world who are constantly facing adversity. They're constantly struggling with neighboring conflicts, with drought, with weather, so on and so forth. And then Judaism is a story about how God comes in and intervenes, fixes, gives further instruction, sometimes smites these people and is upset with them and leaves them bereft, and sometimes actively kills them. But for the most part, there is this trajectory that if we listen to God, then God is there for us, and we must make sure that we understand what God actually wants from us. I'm going to skip this here. Don't worry too much about it. I'm essentially just saying, as in the Mesopotamian example, when I showed through the eras or eons, you would get the gods that reflect the social setting, the socio-historical realities that they're presented with. So when the Mesopotamians were agriculturally based, their gods were agricultural. There was a god of rain, a god of sun, a god of the crops, a god of disease, so on and so forth. Once they became civilized, or large civilizations, those gods represented father figures and kings and so on and so forth. The same goes for Judaism, the same goes for Christianity, the same goes for Islam, and most definitely Hinduism as well. So I don't want you to think that these traditions are immune to the projection of a society onto their god or gods. So God tends to reflect what we care about. And you'll see that as we move through this Jewish history, you'll see that God kind of changes here and there. Okay, so back to the map. Here we actually have the 12 tribes of Israel mapped out. I keep talking about those descendants of Jacob through Abraham through Jacob. Not all 12 are listed here for reasons that we don't need to get into, but you can see that different portions of this are kind of partitioned off and seen as each and every community. Now, whether or not these were just different sub-communities who spoke the same language but had different ethnic or societal ties with each other, and then they just created a story like the 12 sons of this ancient patriarch Abraham, or if they're actually the descendants or sons of Jacob through Abraham, we don't really know, right? But the anthropologists would likely say, look, these people have existed in this region for a long time, and then these stories are created to give a sense of their own history, of their own place in this world, to kind of give themselves a larger perspective on where they come from. Okay, so the first part of history we're going to talk about, of Jewish history, is King David. Now, King David, I have on this slide the last bullet point, I think. This is the same David as Michelangelo's David. This is also the same David as David and Goliath. Now, to my earlier point, we can corroborate a lot of this history, but was there actually a beast, Goliath, who David fought? Not necessarily. Maybe these stories are exaggerated a bit, just like we exaggerate our own nation's history in many ways, in order to kind of allow it to settle with us more permanently, to kind of give it more purpose than perhaps the actual historical event is able to do itself. So, King David was a human being, a real person, who ruled this region of Canaan. He was the monarch, the king of this united 12 tribes between 1000 and 961 BCE. So we have actual historical documents and archaeological evidence that corroborates this rule of this man named David. His legacy is that he united these 12 tribes. So they were somewhat disparate, not totally interconnected. And he says, no, we are not a separate people. We are not 12 separate tribes. We are one people. So he unites them under one monarchy, ruling himself. And like I say, he is the David of David and Goliath. Now, some people say, oh, the story of David and Goliath is crazy. There was not this 9-foot-something beast that 5-foot-something David was able to slay against all odds. But if we look at the combination with real history that we are able to corroborate or legitimize, there's something to it. Not that there's an actual Goliath human being, but rather that Goliath is representative of a neighboring civilization that was thought to be much more powerful. So the story of the underdog, those who do not have, the military might or the ability to beat the group that is thought to be more powerful. So in history, we actually find that there is this neighboring. Actually, let's see if I go back here. It is not on this map. I have it on another map. But there is this neighboring civilization, the Philistines, or Philistia. And Goliath is thought to actually be a representation of Philistia, of these Philistine people who were thought to be much more powerful and able to kind of take over this whole region of Canaan. But under the rule of King David, they, the underdogs, fought against the Philistines, and they beat the Philistines. They pushed them back, and they were able to retain their land, the land that they thought has been given to them by God himself. So, of course, the story, this myth begins to develop thereafter of David beating Goliath, or the military of King David, the Canaanites beating a much stronger, much more established military of the Philistines. So, because of this win, David is then understood as this rightful ruler, one that we should follow. Look what he's done for us, his people. And then we're going to come back in a few slides here and talk about this idea of the Messiah in Judaism. And the Messiah becomes a really important figure because the Messiah carries over into Christianity, most definitely, in a very direct way, but also loosely in Islam as well. There's this kind of Messiah-like figure that's supposed to return that we'll talk about in a later lecture. But for now, you should know that the Messiah in Judaism and in Christianity, the Messiah is supposed to come through the line of King David. So the direct descendant of King David, a direct descendant of King David, will be the Messiah. A Messiah is later understood to be someone who will return to kind of usher in an era of peace and justice and stability. And then, as I noted in the beginning, this is Michelangelo's David. He's kind of seen as the perfect man, the image of masculinity and of one who can rule a people in a just, benevolent way. After King David, King Solomon takes over this region of Canaan. Now, King David's legacy, if you remember, is uniting the 12 tribes. King Solomon rules for about 30 years himself. After King David, these tribes are united because of King David. But Solomon does something a little different. His legacy is building the temple. So remember, up until this point, we have this thing called the tabernacle. If you remember, the tabernacle is this tent-like structure that is maybe the size of a temple, but it's posts and it is canvas. And the problem with the tabernacle is that it implies migration, right? You can break it down, you can walk with it, and you can set it back up. And they started having trouble with this because they said, no, this is the land that God guaranteed to us through the covenant that he engaged in with Abraham. This is our land. We will stay here permanently and forever. So we don't need something that we need to travel with. We need a solid temple, a permanent temple, a home that is fit for God. So in the background here, this is, again, just an artistic representation or guess at what the temple might have looked like, that first temple. And they build this first temple under the rule of King Solomon. And at this temple, sacrifices are performed daily. They're called burnt offerings. So they would bring various types of animals, but one would bring their best and greatest, most pure, unscathed animal to the temple, and they would sacrifice it into the fire for God. Some say this is related to the Zoroastrian practice of giving offerings to fire to give to God. The thing we care about more is that this is the way in which the people, the Canaanites, communicated to God. There was not anything like prayer, or we have no records of prayer existing during this time. If you wanted to speak to God, if you wanted to show God your love, if you wanted to show God that you are following him or it, then you offer sacrifices. You give God the best of what you have. Why? Because God has given you everything you have. So you will show him that you will give the best of what you have, and you're okay with even less than what he has given you, because God is plentiful. He has given you so much. So this is the way you worship God. We have many precedents for this. We didn't go over this, but in the story of Noah, Noah offers a burnt offering to God in this story. Abraham is to sacrifice his son. What does God do? He intervenes and replaces Abraham's son with a ram, depending on which translation of the story you're reading. God instructs Moses to also give a burnt offering. God shows himself in the form of a burning bush, so God is kind of seen in the form of fire. There's a lot of precedence for this expectation that the way in which we should communicate with God is through burnt offerings. And again, like I was saying, this is the rightful homeland. This is at least their thought at this point, that God guaranteed us this land through this covenant. Therefore, we must build a permanent home to respect this and to establish this as our city. So this becomes, no surprise to most of you, the holy city of Jerusalem, right? The south central region of Canaan. There's this city or emerging city of Jerusalem that is established through the building of this temple. Solomon then dies, and after he dies, we see a split amongst what was once a united kingdom under the monarchs of David and Solomon, split up into two kingdoms. So there are two distinct kingdoms instead of one united kingdom. And you can see that kingdom here. Sorry, I just want to make sure we're still rolling here. Where are we? Yes, we are going. Okay. So you can see these two kingdoms here. And I need you to know the names of these kingdoms, and I want you to know which one is in the north and which one is in the south. That might seem somewhat arbitrary, but it becomes historically important, as you'll see on the very next slide. Just a note before I talk about these two kingdoms, look here. This is the land of Canaan. This is the Mediterranean. This is the Dead Sea. What neighboring states do we see? We see these Philistine states, right? And here's Jerusalem, the center of the kingdom. This is where we think the conflict occurred between Philistia, or the Philistine states, and Canaan, between King David and what is later kind of represented by as Goliath. Okay, now, in the north we have the kingdom of Israel. In the south we have the kingdom of Judah. Now these two names are very important in the history of Judaism. Judah, as you remember on the very first slide under terminology, I said this comes from the Hebrew word Yehud, which means thanksgiving or praise. This gives us the word Judaism or Jewish. Israel, of course, is important in many ways. It means to wrestle with God. Isra, to wrestle. El, meaning God. It also is the name of Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, who populates this exact area with his supposed 12 sons. They become the 12 sons of Israel. Now, we're going to learn in the very next slide, these two kingdoms fall. They're defeated, they're conquested, many times actually. The first to fall is Israel. The Assyrian armies come in from the north. It's a large, massive empire. They come in, I believe, in 722 BCE, and they destroy this northern kingdom. I want you to know that. Why is it important? Well, we already see a dismantling of what is a smaller civilization to a much larger militarily advanced civilization. But the important thing is, yes, they were defeated. Many were killed in the battle. Some were able to retreat down into the south. This kingdom of Judah remained standing for a while. But what is important is the kingdom of Judah contains Jerusalem. This contains the temple, which, if you remember, in that room in the back center of the temple, the Holy of Holies, contains the Ark of the Covenant. And what is important about the Ark of the Covenant? God himself resides there. So yes, as the Assyrians come in and defeat this northern kingdom, they at least have not taken God. They have not destroyed the home of God. And frankly, God's instruction, right? Because what's in that Ark of the Covenant? The Ten Commandments. However, what we'll learn is within 150 years, by 586 BCE, we get another kingdom to come through, even larger than the Assyrian Empire. The Babylonians come through, and they destroy the southern kingdom, including the temple, and they steal the Ark of the Covenant. So we'll go over that history again here in bullet point form. So 722 BCE, the Assyrians come in and they defeat that northern kingdom of Israel. Some escape to Judah, some are defeated, some are brought into the Assyrian army and used as slaves or forced labor. 150 years later, the Babylonians come in from the east. They invade the southern kingdom of Judah. They defeat them quite easily, and they destroy Solomon's temple. So that temple, the home of God, that permanent home of God on the land guaranteed to them through that covenant with Abraham, is destroyed, and that Ark of the Covenant is lost, and it's lost forever. To this day, no one has found this Ark of the Covenant. There's speculation as to where it might be, but the short of it is we don't know where it is. It was supposedly gold-plated and ornate and so on and so forth, so it's quite possible that it was dismantled and sold for its more face value. How do we know this? We can read it in the book of Ezra. The ancient Hebrews themselves admit that this was lost, that the Babylonians took it during this defeat. And then we have other historical records that this conquest did occur as well, including some of the archaeological existence of the first temple that is near the Temple Mount in Jerusalem today. So this period of time is incredibly important, and you need to understand this point. The temple's destroyed. They are ripped from their own homeland, that land that was guaranteed to them, and they are brought back to Babylon. Babylon is basically modern-day Iraq, ancient Mesopotamia area, the region where the story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, was written and passed down through this period of time. So they live during this time in a state of what is called diaspora. Diaspora, think of the word to be dispersed. They are dispersed from their homeland. So if a community today, the Armenians, for example, are living in diaspora, they are living outside of their homeland. They were forced to leave their homeland and are not allowed to return to their homeland. Why is this important? Because so much of their history, their religious beliefs are tied to a homeland. So for the Hebrews, living in diaspora means they're living in a state where Hebrew is not spoken. They don't have their temple. They don't have their, the food they typically eat, the communities that they've established, so on and so forth. Incredibly devastating for any community to live in what's called diaspora. Now, they're forced to live in this place called Babylon, which is ancient Mesopotamia. And during this 50-year period where they're forced to live there, many of them assimilate to this larger culture. They begin to speak the language, they begin to intermarry, they begin to work and have children of their own in this new land. 50 years is essentially a generation. One question they face, and this is an important question, a question that they will come back to later in history, about 600 years later in history, is how the hell do we worship God without our temple? God gave us very clear instruction. Build me a sanctuary so I may dwell among you. And we built you a sanctuary, and then we built you a big permanent temple in the middle of the land that you guaranteed to us. That's all gone, right? How did they communicate with God? How did they worship God? They offered burnt offerings in the temple grounds. So that's all gone, and they are starting to question how they go about communicating with God. Remember, prayer is not commonplace. It's not actually in existence. People are not around praying to God. The way that you communicate to God is through sacrifice. So some people say, should we build another tabernacle? And others are saying, no, we must return to our homeland. The tabernacle just means we're going to be on a constant move. We need to have more direct efforts to return to Jerusalem. Others are saying, great, fine. But in the meantime, how do we talk to God? So this is the first time that prayer becomes an option. There's this old prophet. His name's Hosea, I believe. And he was thought to exist in the 7 or 800 BCE, so about 300 years prior to this time. And he had this prophecy that they had written down in their Hebrew Bible, that becomes part of the Hebrew Bible. And he says something to the effect of, there will come a time when we must rely on offerings of the lips instead of bulls. So people begin to ruminate on this and try to make sense of it, and they interpret this to mean, oh, we shouldn't rely on the sacrificing of bulls, as in actual animals that we sacrifice, but rather we should rely on sacrifices of the lips in what we say, in what we do. So people begin to speak to God, talk to God in the way that we're quite accustomed to today. Jews and Christians and Muslims often speak to God through prayer, whether silently or out loud. So this is the first time that prayer becomes an option. Now, you can see a map here. This is kind of the forced migration outward. Babylon is here between the Tigris and Euphrates River. This is not just a day's jaunt. This is a treacherous journey that takes weeks on end to complete. It's dangerous. It's not an easy thing. The reason I even have this map up here is because once they are freed from the Babylonian captivity, it's not so easy just to return. It's not like, okay, let's just walk on back. It's quite a journey, especially if you've lived your entire life here. If you were born 5 years into the captivity and you're now 45 years old, your entire life has been in this area of Babylon. So, in 539, this guy, Cyrus the Great, he's a Persian emperor, comes through and he defeats the Babylonians. So he's defeating this region of Babylon that is holding captive these Canaanite or Israelite people. Now, what's interesting about Cyrus the Great and his great Persian empire is they are Zoroastrian. So the Persians are thoroughly Zoroastrian. Zoroastrianism is a large, booming, popular religion at the time, and they are gaining in power and influence. So not only have the early Hebrews been exposed to ancient Mesopotamian culture with things like the Epic of Gilgamesh that included stories about existential angst, that had things like the flood, a serpent, a garden, questions of immortality, high gods, and so on and so forth. This is during the time when these Hebrews are writing the Bible. So these stories are directly borrowed from their Babylonian captors and infused directly into the Bible. And then we get Cyrus the Great, who's Zoroastrian, who comes through, and we get all of these new influences. If you remember our section on Zoroastrianism, very distinct moral dualism, so good versus evil, light versus darkness. There is a one uncreated high God, only one God. This is the only religion at the time that believes in one God. We get this further influence of Zoroastrianism onto Judaism, or early Judaism, more appropriately ancient Israelite religion. So, Cyrus the Great is, as his name says, great. He's a nice dude. He's a great conqueror and a benevolent one. And he says, who are you, Hebrew Canaanite people? You don't seem threatening to me, and you want to go back to this small place called Jerusalem to build your temple because this is important to you and you have your one God? Sure, go. I have no objection. I'm not interested in you. I have much larger goals in my life than to deal with this small minority group who speaks a language that I don't fully understand. Sure, go back to your place called Jerusalem and build your temple. Now, many remain in Babylon. As I said, if you're spending your entire life there, you've married, you have children, you have your job, and then someone comes through and takes your oppressor out. They conquer those who are oppressing you and say, hey, now you're free. Life just got a lot better for you. You now have a better status in this region, so many stay. They say, why would I go back to this place that my ancestors care about when I am here and now? So many stay, however, many do return. They say, no, it is our duty. We must recommit ourselves to God's instruction. We must rebuild the temple and restore that covenant with God. So they're going back, as I said, with much more familiarity with Mesopotamian stories and with Zoroastrianism. This is beginning the period of what we call canonization. Now, to canonize is to make authoritative a certain selection of texts. So, at the time, there are lots of Hebrew stories that you find in the Bible, and more than those stories. To canonize the Bible is to decide which ones are included in the official authoritative Bible. So it's during this period of selecting which stories are important that they are exposed to many of the same stories that we see in these other world traditions that exist long before Judaism and long, long before Christianity. Okay, so the temple's rebuilt under Persian rule. Everyone's happy. This is the Second Temple period, hence the heading up here. The Second Temple period lasts from 530-ish to 70 CE. So for about 600 years, you have the Second Temple standing in Jerusalem. Eventually, however, that Persian Empire that was kind to the Israelites is defeated as well. There's a series of wars. We're not going to go into all the detail here. What I want you to know is, as this region, Canaan, is conquested and conquered by each and every group coming through, the Israelites were able to retain control over, at the very least, the temple itself. Sometimes a greater extent in the north and out to the Dead Sea and into the Mediterranean. But at the very least, they were able to control at least the temple itself, and it was not destroyed during this 500-year period. The Torah is complete. Remember, the Torah is what? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It is the first part of the Tanakh, the first of 3 parts to the Tanakh. The second 2 parts, the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim, the prophets and the writings, these are still being produced. So many of those stories that we see in Ecclesiastes and Book of Daniel and so on and so forth, these are still being written during this time. Now, we need to talk just briefly about this word Hellenization. Hellenization means to make Greek, not just in language, but also in its form of politics, in its culture, in its everything to do with culture is infused with the Greek way of life. So, during this time, Alexander the Great comes through. He's a great Macedonian ruler who speaks Greek, who is kind of, everything about him is Greek. He comes through and he's this large conqueror, or large army, and he takes over this whole region, and everything in the region is made into Greek. So people are speaking Greek, the form of politics are in Greek, the religion is Greek influenced, the philosophy, everything is made into a Greek way of life. This is the context in which Judaism, Rabbinic Judaism, comes out of this ancient Israelite religion, and this is the context in which Christianity is born as well. So for those of you who know some of your history of the Bible, you'll know that the New Testament, the Christian Testament, is written in Greek, mostly Greek. This is because this is a period of time when everyone in this region is speaking Greek. So we're going to come back to this point. The other thing I want to note about this Greek influence or this Hellenization is that the form of literature, the style of literature, is also Greek, which means they write in allegory, they write in metaphor. They're not writing legalistically or literally. So during the time in which the Bible was written, the predominant way in which one told a story was through metaphor. So it's quite odd that we have 20th and 21st century Christians concerned with whether or not the flood actually happened, or concerned with whether or not certain early Christian miracles, the miracles of Jesus, for example, actually occurred, when they were written in an obviously allegorical fashion. So we need to take that into consideration when we read these stories and try to understand the intent of these stories, the meaning of these stories. We're going to come back to that during Christianity. Okay. So, during the Second Temple period, remember the Second Temple is still standing at this point, there was this revolt, we're going to talk about this in the next lecture, against these Hellenistic influences. So these early Jewish, I should say, still actually Israelites, were speaking Hebrew. They have their own religion. They have their own kind of way about them, though they're being more and more and more influenced by these Greek ways. There's a pushback against these Hellenistic influences called the Maccabean Revolt, led by Judas Maccabeus. So Judas Maccabeus takes his people, he revolts against the overriding Greek influence at the time, and they take over their temple, they return it to a pure and traditional form, and they reestablish their control over the temple. They see themselves as establishing God in control once again. So that was successful. We're going to actually come back to this, and we're going to talk about how Hanukkah is actually kind of a memorialization or remembrance of this event. Because at the end of this revolt, they went to the temple, and as they dedicated it to God one more time, they lit a candle in the temple, and there was only enough oil for one day of burning for this candle, and they lit it anyway to dedicate it to God, and it did not last one day, it lasted 8 days. And these 8 days are thought to be a miracle, a sign from God who is approving of their reconquesting the temple and rededicating it to God. So this is in Hanukkah, there are 8 days of lighting the menorah, and this is kind of to remember that miracle of the 8 days in which that candle burned, that oil burned when it wasn't supposed to. Then a larger empire comes through, an empire that is one of the largest in all of history. The Roman Empire rolls through in 63 BCE and lasts through the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th century, and so on and so forth. It's at this point, under Roman rule, that different Jewish groups start to form. So you have this Israelite emerging Jewish community, and they have their differences among them. You get some who are more priestly, you get some that are more lay people, and so on and so forth. And 4 distinct groups form that we'll talk about for just a second here. Or in just a second here. The other thing that's happening at this time is there is this concept of the Messiah that is coming back into fashion, right? So the Messiah is a tradition, a story that's been told for hundreds of years for these ancient Israelites. And Messiah, I want you to know where this comes from. It comes from the Hebrew word Mashiach, which just means the anointed one or the poured one. So by anointed or poured, it's referring to the fact that when someone becomes a king, he is anointed with oil. Oil is poured on his forehead. It is a ceremony that kind of brings the king into power, introduces the king into power. So the idea was that the Messiah, the one that they are expecting to come back to usher in an era of peace and justice and stability, is supposed to be a king, not supernatural, not a god, not the son of God, but just a king, just like King David was, a human being who will live and die, but in that lifetime will be a political and military ruler, not someone from heaven. He'll be a descendant of King David, and he will restore world order, or city order, order to the temple itself, Jerusalem. Temple service will go back to what it was, and peace will be secured in this region. So, from the Jewish perspective, the Messiah is supposed to be a human being. I keep saying this because it's important once we get to Christianity, we see that Christianity takes this a different direction, and the Messiah is interpreted to be Jesus, who is later, 300 years later, interpreted to be not just a human being, but also God himself. So there's some disagreement there in the texts. The Old Testament says one thing, the New Testament says something different. Okay, so these 4 groups that exist under Roman rule, the first are the Pharisees. These are the ones, if you remember, talking about the Talmud, this oral Torah, this commentary or interpretation of the Tanakh. These are the ones who create that Talmud. They're the ones who study Torah, teach Torah, and they're saying, look, once spoiler alert here, in 70 CE, the temple's destroyed. So once that temple is destroyed, the Pharisees are able to look to other sources for understanding God. The others, who are much more literal, like the Sadducees, they're saying, no, 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 no. You can't look to other things. The Torah is very clear. The Torah says we must sacrifice. We must give burnt offerings to God in the temple. So when the temple's destroyed, the Sadducees lose all relevance. It doesn't make any sense. They can't practice the tradition that they're advocating because there is no temple. So once it's realized that that temple is gone forever and is not going to be rebuilt, the Pharisees' way of life, the perspective that says, look, the temple's gone, but we can still speak to God in other ways. We must look back at our text and make sure we fully understand it. We must engage in more interpretation. We must add commentary to the Torah. That commentary is the Talmud. This becomes rabbinic Judaism. Judaism with rabbis who interpret texts and offer new interpretations or commentary. The other two groups, both groups do not last through history, but they're interesting and we should at least mention them. The first one are the Essenes. The Essenes are a group who are thought to be a bit more concerned with purity. They're withdrawn from society. They live out in this desert area called Qumran that is extremely hot, and they expect the world to be ending any year. So they think the world's going to end. They want to be as pure as possible. They remove themselves from society, and they write scripture. They keep writing the Hebrew Bible essentially over and over and over again, and they're adding their interpretations to it as well. The problem here is most of them die. They're not supposed to procreate. It's supposed to be a male-only society, though there's evidence that says that's not the case. They die of disease, and then the Romans come through, and they basically squash the rest of those who are still alive. Their modern relevance is that they wrote those things they were writing out in Qumran are known today as the Dead Sea Scrolls. So they're the earliest forms of scripture that we have in hard copy. We discovered these just recently in the 20th century, mid-20th century, and we have done a lot of work interpreting them, translating them, and preserving them so we get a better understanding of the types of beliefs that existed during this period of time. The fourth group, the fourth kind of, Israelite group that existed in Jerusalem were the Zealots, and these, as their name kind of sounds, zealous, they're the ones who wanted to fight against the Roman rule. They said, no, we need to reestablish our place, kind of like the Maccabees, the Maccabean revolt. They say, no, we must establish our temple religion again. We must recover our temple from this Roman influence, take it back from them, and fight for it. Unfortunately for them, the Roman military was 100 times more powerful, 1,000 times more powerful, but even their presence in Jerusalem was so much more powerful. The Zealots had no chance. They were eliminated, and there was this kind of showdown at this place called Masada, which we won't go into, but the point is they fought and they lost. Okay, so that second temple is now destroyed. It's gone. It's no longer in existence. So this radically changes the way in which you practice your religion. Remember, if you're a Sadducee, you need that temple. If you're a Zealot, you need that temple. The Pharisees are saying, yes, the temple is the most important thing there is, but when it's destroyed, they are able to try to make sense of it. They're able to look to other sources in order to try to understand what God wants from us. What is the lesson we should learn? So from this point forward, we get rabbinic Judaism. We get Judaism that is a religion that is no longer focused on sacrifices at a temple, but is rather focused on reading text, understanding what God wants from us, and offering interpretations. And new practices evolve thereafter. Practices like prayer, practices like symbolic offerings, different holidays begin to emerge to remember much of the history that we just talked about. So when we come back in part 3 of this three-part series on Judaism, we'll talk about rabbinic Judaism. This is the Judaism that you're maybe more familiar with, that if you have friends who are Jewish, if you yourself are Jewish, this will be much more familiar because it's not an ancient Israelite tradition that is focused on sacrifice at a temple, but it is a modern practice that comes out as a response from the destruction of that second temple.